this particular video, I'm going to be discussing and analyzing the differences now between where the complexes of the mind arise essentially through the first two intelligences that derive all intelligence, which is logical and emotional intelligence. In terms of logical intelligence, as an example, compared to emotional intelligence, it is as a form of a perspective. So when you see a logical intelligence in a person, you're already starting to see the development of an intelligence complex. Whereas if you were to look at an individual that is driven by emotion, most oftentimes they act out of feeling rather than acting based on control. And so now when we look at emotional disorders or emotional stress disorders, such as mental conditions that are as a result of an over-generation of the emotional cortex. In the emotional cortex, now imagine that the more I would stimulate the emotional response of a person through years and years and years and years of repetitive emotional manipulation, to the point that they arrive now where they enter a psychotic break. And I will discuss how that psychotic break essentially works. In the development of psychosis is as a result of poorly apprehended emotional response. In a way that psychosis in itself can be brought on by drugs, which itself cause a hypersaturation of neurotransmitters, emotions which are poorly apprehended or comprehended, you could say, emotions that are not expressed or understood, but are simply negatively, you could say, expressed in a poor expression, such as a lack of body language, a lack of vocal resonance in their emotional state they may express within the particular emotion. And due to this particular buildup of neurotransmitters, you could see that the essential emotion is the generator of the neurotransmitter that passes the emotion through its physiology. And in the emotion, the moment we enter the point where the individual doesn't express, well, it creates a stunting at the neural receptor pathway capability. Because if you're not going to let that emotion be processed, it creates a stunting, and as a result, it creates that nucleation point within the frontal cortex. Where within the frontal cortex, you're now seeing people with emotional distress disorders, and you might say, well, how can we treat that? Well, to a certain degree, you could actively treat an emotional distress disorder by actively creating a logical response to that emotional distress disorder. In the use of antipsychotics, the main function behind its physiology effects is meant to create in your mind a emotional response, gain a logical perspective. And now when you look at the opposite, where when we look at now logical stimulus or logical intelligence formulation, in the intelligence of, in the formulation of logical intelligence, you would then see things arise such as logical disorders, such as an attention deficit disorder. In an attention deficit disorder, the only true nature of that particular disorder is the fact that the child is very intelligent, but it is simply now diving into everything that it hears and learns and enters a state of a hyper focal point known as a fixation. In logical people, we then see the beginning of such a thing as what is known as fixations, which means they begin diving on top of a subject and begin pulling it apart to understand it better. But in doing so, in this fixation, you essentially see that you can imagine a young developed child with ADHD or an attention deficit disorder, which is essentially their brain is picking apart the subject at a further rate than that which it is being taught. And because it's teaching itself on its own based on understanding the subject, well, we have to create an emotional or a psychotic entryway so that it may create an emotional connection to the subject now, where it begins to slow down its breaking down of the subject. And so you might see an introduction such of a thing as an amphetamine type substance, which is a speed which creates a resulting in a more level, less fixated personality. In the amphetamine, it is essentially speeding up the individual's thought process, where rather than seeing the individual then slow down its learning ability according to the teacher's perception, which according to the teacher's perception, the teacher might say the child is picking apart the material too much and it is now resulting in its inability to keep up with the class. So we need to supplement it or treat it with, and then we might say, well, there's a business model here. Because if we're constantly going from emotional to logical intelligence and we're always battling it with a treatment now, it gets to a point where we now have to realize at which point are we simply accepted as a human consciousness. Because if we are accepted as a human consciousness, then we would not be fighting against that particular consciousness. But in the understanding of human nature, we are afraid of things that which we do not understand, which has created our either emotional or logical response in our intelligence. Now, when we dive further into the talk of logical and emotional intelligence, and we arrive now at the opposing force, in the opposing force of each intelligence, you find its opposite treatment. But if its opposite treatment creates the opposite effect, that would arise essentially that in the counterbalance is essentially meant to create a unity, where you are actively playing God if you're a psychiatrist, because you're trying to essentially pull one particular individual's mental state and create unity, where you now create a more complete individual simply based on introducing a drug that introduces a change in their physiological process. The problem now is we have to change their mental process as well. And in the idea of fixing an individual, if we solely rely based on just a drug experience, you could say that that in itself is just like putting a band-aid over a wound. It doesn't do the healing, it creates a support for the healing to take place. But now we have to find a way to make the healing take place, which is where we see now the rise in the logical explanation of things, the 4 stages at which we can treat mental health, and they follow through quarters or quarters. The first stage is the recognition in the individual that it must possibly or seek help. The first step is the seeking help aspect. The second help is accepting the help. The second step is accepting the help. So you go from seeking the help to accepting the help, applying the help, and the fourth step is you have to actively do the work on your own now and fix yourself. But how do these individuals know how to fix themselves if they're not taught a basis to begin understanding themselves from? Because see, once we create emotional or intelligent complex, logical complexes of the mind, and we do not create a way for the individual to balance out or learn how to balance out as they experience the rapid balancing out, this creates a state of confusion, which in itself could cause individuals to enter trance-like states where they no longer recognize their experience as real. Because in the logical formulation of the rapid change in their physiological process brought on by the antipsychotic medication, we would now see that in their effects they have on the mind of the individual, let alone the physiological effect, we would see that it is essentially a form of a tranquilizer. And in the emotional tranquility is where the individual is thought then to create logical understanding of their emotions. But the problem now is if we do not create a way to have essentially an example, we do not essentially get to see how you can pull into a further logical understanding of your emotions. And if you can't pull into the logical understanding of your emotions, well, you're going to stay in a stagnant state. But the problem now is in the rapid growth of the opposing force and the inability to balance out, because if you're going to introduce an opposing force at its furthest polar opposite peak, which means if you're in a depressed mental health state, not only are you introducing the furthest opposite peak or a polar opposite, you're introducing it as opposite potential as well. Which if you're highly depressed and in psychosis as a result of a emotional distress disorder, and then we introduce a very highly stimulant of logical intelligence, what ends up happening now is we see that individuals will essentially cause such a confused state that they pull away from the human experience. They become alienated. And so in the idea of true treatment for individuals, the idea should not be of a antipsychotic, it should be of a pro-psychotic treatment. And the idea of reversing the opposing force by not creating a physiological effect, but by creating a mental effect. We can achieve this particular effect the moment we introduce a pattern of reflection, which in itself, a reflection on emotion such as an emotional intelligence, a pattern where we introduce a reflective state, such as a psychotherapy. In a psychotherapy, you would then see that the emotional processing of understanding said emotion in its reflective pattern, the individual has no other option but to create a logical understanding of its emotions, rather than creating a stunting and physiological process that changes not just the way the mind works, but the way the body works in its formulation itself. We could actively see that we could be changing people's mental health by creating therapy sessions. And in therapy sessions, rather than dissecting the body, which is the purpose of understanding psychiatry, which if you wish to understand the mind, imagine now psychiatry is in itself the initial practice of understanding the mind, which then the Protestants of psychiatry became psychologists, which are people that believe you can dissect the mind at the thought and not at the body, which at the thought itself, the idea is you can analyze a person in their train, whether they are of logical or emotional intelligence, and you may begin in your psychoanalysis, in their psychotherapy, you may now begin essentially pulling back on their life until you see where the repetition of the first onset of fear or trauma generated the first generation of either logical or emotional response. And we can see the patterns of this very first onset then build as what is known as entire life, which creates a deeply rooted experience in self-reflection. And in this deeply rooted self-expression or reflection, you then begin to see where we can pull a hypnotic state, where in the psychoanalysis and the psychotherapy, if I was to now make you aware of one particular point, which in the therapy itself, the act of therapy is not to specifically tell you your problems don't exist. Your problems do exist. The thing you have to realize is you have not been strong enough to be able to withstand them. And so now if you apply that particular saying to your very first onset of either fear or trauma or discipline, which in your first response of natural action, you can actively see a tremendous depth of reflection where you see and can actively feel a rewiring of your nervous system, where you can actively create a tremendous change in the person's thought process going forward. This is known as a healing. And through this thought process of the psychology, you could actively create what is known as a miracle, which you could treat something that doesn't seem perceivable to physical reality, but in itself is a mental reality, but is experienced within the physical reality, yet is invisible, which is the mind. And if we can learn to treat the mind not by treating it through a physical process, but through a mental process, which is a true fundamental understanding behind the idea of psychology rather than psychiatry. Psychiatry is the idea of treating the mind using physical process altering stimulus, whereas psychology is the act of using mental process stimulus in order to create a change in the repetitive pattern, Anyways, in terms of the healing now, this is the beginning of the journey. And the more we can pursue this rewiring process, you can actively see that you yourself can become your own rewiring person, where you can actively create this generated thought reflection. It simply is about how you choose to reintroduce what is known as the trance state. And the trance state is where you find the attention deficit. Because in the attention deficit, the moment you enter the thought reflection, well then guess what? You are actively pulling further and further and further into your reflective pattern. Which means the moment we can identify or create a hyperfocal point known as the fixation, known as a trance state, if I can generate a trance state in the individual, well then I can create its reflective pattern. Which begs the question, at which degree now are we seeing attention deficit disorders be truly of a negative diagnosis towards young individuals? To a certain point, you can help individuals, but you can't say, I know everything the individual should do. In the ego of man, we can actively say that you can guide a person, you can only show them the door. If they walk through it, is up to them at that point. And so, with the business models regarding around the mental conditions we develop as a result of emotional or logical intelligence, if the idea is to rebalance out the individual, well then I would argue that in the rebalancing out of a mental stimulus, the fundamental truth should not be to change the physiological process, but to change the mental process, which in itself can create a similar effect to the mind that which surgery would have to the body. An immediate fix within a rapid change in time. Thank you.